Sir, I need you to calm down.
No.
I need her removed. She does not belong here. Someone made a mistake. Get her off this plane.
Some of the most powerful real-life stories begin in silence. This is one of them. One of those touching stories no one sees coming. One of the black stories that demands to be told not because it is extraordinary, but because it is not. Because it has happened before. Because it will happen again. Because the woman sitting in seat 2A has lived some version of this moment her entire life. And These are the life stories that don't make headlines the first time around. They live quietly in the bodies of people who have learned to absorb the unbearable and keep moving. The cabin of Flight MV-471 smelled like leather and money. It was the kind of aircraft most people never board in their lifetime. Not a commercial flight, not a connection, a reserved charter Aspen-Pitkin County Airport to Washington, D.C., carrying the most concentrated collection of aviation power and investment capital in the country. Outside, the Colorado sky burned gold and rust, the Rockies pressing close against the tarmac, the way they always did in October, indifferent and enormous. Inside, the light was soft. The seats were wide. The conversation, what little existed, was hushed and careful, the way conversation always sounds when the people having it are worth hundreds of millions of dollars and know it. Luggage with monograms. Suits that cost more than most people's monthly rent. Briefcases that hadn't been purchased, they had been commissioned. Everyone in that cabin carried their status visibly like a second skin they had learned to wear before anything else. Everyone except the woman in seat 2A. She wore a navy blazer over simple dark slacks. Her hair was short, natural silver, threaded through black, in the way that only comes from decades of actual living. Reading glasses sat low on her nose. In her lap was a paperback, the kind with a creased spine and soft corners, a book that had been read before and was being read again. No designer bag in the overhead. No monogram on her carry-on. No assistant hovering nearby. No that she was anything other than a woman who had found a quiet seat and intended to use it. Every other passenger in that cabin was performing power. She simply was it. She didn't know that yet. She couldn't have known that the man who had just stepped through the forward cabin door was already looking at her. Already deciding. Gregory Whitmore boarded last. That was how men like Gregory Whitmore operated. They arrived last, because last meant watched. It meant every head in the cabin had already turned already registered. The entrance already understood that this was a man who did not wait for rooms to be ready. Rooms were always ready for Gregory Whitmore. He was 58 years old, silver-haired, broad-shouldered, in a charcoal Italian suit that moved with him the way expensive fabric always does. His watch caught the cabin light. His leather briefcase was the color of dark cognac. He had been flying in first class since before some of the people on that flight had started high school, and his body understood the geometry of premium cabins the way athletes understand courts. He stepped in. He scanned the seats the way a man scans a room he already owns. And then he stopped. His eyes landed on seat 2A, on the navy blazer, on the paperback, on the woman who had not looked up. Something moved across his face. Not anger, not yet. Something quieter than that, and more dangerous. A calculation. A conclusion reached in under 3 seconds the way certain kinds of bias always operate fast, and certain and dressed up as logic. He did not take his seat. Instead, he turned, and before he had fully cleared the galley threshold, before his briefcase had been stowed, before he had said a word to anyone else, he raised one finger toward Rachel Donovan, who was standing near the forward service cart adjusting the beverage setup for departure. Rachel was 39 and had spent 11 years in premium cabin service. She had learned to read passengers the way meteorologists read pressure systems. She saw the gesture. She saw the expression behind it. She moved toward him with the professional calm of someone who already understood that the next few minutes were going to require every tool in her training. Whitmore kept his voice low, which somehow made it worse. "Excuse me. That woman in 2A, is she in the right seat? This is a reserved charter. There must be an error." Rachel didn't hesitate. She pulled the manifest on her tablet, scrolled once. Her voice was even. "Dr. Langford is confirmed in 2A, sir. Her seat assignment is valid." Whitmore's jaw tightened. The word valid seemed to land on him the wrong way, as if the confirmation itself was an inconvenience he hadn't budgeted for. He looked back at seat 2A. The woman had not moved, had not looked up, was still reading. This somehow made it worse. He looked back at Rachel. His voice dropped another register the way certain men's voices do when they are about to say something they know they shouldn't say out loud and have decided to say anyway. "I know everyone on this manifest. I've attended this summit for 9 consecutive years. I know the investors. I know the executives. I know the federal representatives." He paused. "I do not know her." Rachel held his gaze. "With respect, sir, that doesn't change." The cabin had gone very quiet. Not silent. The ambient sounds were still there, the soft whir of the climate system, the distant radio chatter from the tarmac, the small sounds of passengers pretending to look at their phones. But the quality of the quiet had changed. It had become the kind of quiet that happens when people hear something they cannot unhear and are deciding each in their own way whether to act or not. Most were choosing not. The woman in 2A, she had heard every word. Of course she had. The cabin wasn't large. Whitmore hadn't been as quiet as he believed. And Simone Langford had spent 52 years developing the particular skill of hearing everything and showing nothing of absorbing the weight of a moment without letting it reach her face. She turned the page. Her hand was steady. At the window, the gold light of the Colorado mountains pressed against the glass like it was trying to get in. Outside, a ground crew member was completing the final fuel checks on the aircraft, running through a clipboard of certifications for a fuel system, unlike anything that had powered a commercial-grade aircraft just 5 years ago. Nobody in the cabin knew that yet either. The gate agent's voice came through the jetway door calm and procedural. "Ladies and gentlemen, we'll begin our door close in approximately 10 minutes. Whitmore heard it. His chin lifted slightly. He turned back toward Rachel with something new in his expression, not a question anymore. A deadline. Have you ever walked into a room fully qualified and watched someone decide in 3 seconds that you didn't belong? Not because of anything you said, not because of anything you did, but because of what they saw when they looked at you and what they decided it meant. This story is for everyone who has. Gregory Whitmore did not sit down. That was the first thing anyone paying attention would have noticed. Every other passenger had found their seats settled and arranged their things. Whitmore stood in the aisle like a man who had decided the aisle belonged to him, his briefcase still in his hand, his body angled toward Rachel in a way that blocked the forward galley and made it impossible for anyone to move past him without acknowledging his presence. It was not accident. Men like Gregory Whitmore did not do accidental things in public spaces. Everything was architecture. Everything was designed to communicate the same basic message. I am the most important person in this room, and this room will reorganize itself accordingly. Rachel stood her ground, which required more courage than it should have. Whitmore spoke again, and this time, he did not lower his voice. This is a closed manifest, he said. I have attended this summit for 9 consecutive years. I know every investor, every executive, every federal representative on this flight. He paused, and when he continued, his voice carried the particular texture of a man who has never had to wonder whether people were listening. He did not gesture towards seat 2A. He didn't need to. The her was enough. It landed in the cabin like something dropped from a height, and everyone heard it hit. Rachel kept her expression professional with visible effort. Sir, I understand your concern. Her reservation is confirmed and her credentials have been verified. Her seat is valid. Whitmore's eyes moved to Rachel's face and stayed there for a moment in a way that was not quite a stare, but was close enough to make the distinction meaningless. Then he said, "Do you know who I am?" It wasn't. "I represent $4.3 billion in active aviation capital," he said. "I sit on the board of 2 regional carriers. I have personally known your airline's board chairman for over a decade." His voice was smooth and certain, the voice of a man who had used these credentials before and watched them work. He was not threatening Rachel, not technically. He was simply making sure she understood the dimensions of the situation she was standing in. Rachel said nothing. She held the tablet. Whitmore turned then, a slow, deliberate turn, and let his gaze move across the cabin. It was the kind of survey a man conducts when he expects to find agreement waiting for him, faces nodding, eyes confirming the silent chorus of social validation that powerful people learn to depend on. 2 executives near the window seats looked quickly away down at their phones, at their drinks, anywhere that wasn't the aisle. One man in a gray suit seated near the middle of the cabin allowed the faintest smile to cross his face. Not quite approval, but not disapproval either. It was enough. Whitmore filed it away. In seat 2, a Simone Langford turned a page. She did it the way she did everything in that moment, without urgency, without performance, with the steady economy of a person who has decided exactly how much of herself this situation is going to receive. Her eyes moved across the line she was reading. Her hand completed the motion. The page settled. She had heard every word. She had heard the her. She had heard the 4.3 billion. She had heard the silence of the cabin that followed that particular silence, that she had learned to recognize over 52 years, the silence of bystanders calculating their own exposure before deciding whether to speak. She knew that silence the way she knew her own handwriting. She had grown up in it. She had sat in boardrooms and lecture halls and government briefing rooms and absorbed that silence so many times that her body had developed its own response, a kind of internal stillness, a lowering of everything unnecessary so that the essential parts. She had learned long before she had the language to name what she was learning, that reacting was giving men like Gregory Whitmore exactly what they wanted. A reaction meant she was visible in the way they had already decided she should be visible. Rattled. Out of place. Confirming the conclusion they had reached before she opened her mouth. She had made a decision somewhere in her 30s, a quiet, permanent decision, that she would not do that anymore. She would not perform distress for an audience that was waiting for it. So she read. 4 rows back in seat 4C, Nathan Brooks set down his coffee. He was 44 years old and had covered the aviation industry for the Washington Business Review for 16 years. He knew this flight. He had requested a seat on this charter specifically because of who was on it, because the National Future of Aviation Summit had a way of producing the kind of conversations and confrontations that didn't make it into press releases, and Nathan had built his career on exactly those conversations. He had the full passenger manifest in his bag. Printed that morning and annotated in blue ink. He recognized Whitmore immediately. Gregory Whitmore, EVP of Titan Capital Aviation, was not a man who was easy to miss in print or in person. Nathan had written about Titan Capital 3 times in the past 4 years. He knew the portfolio, the capital figures, the board relationships. He knew the reputation. His eyes moved to the woman in 2A. He didn't recognize her. Not immediately. She was turned slightly toward the window, the paperback open in her lap, her profile calm and self-contained. Nathan looked at his annotated manifest. He found seat 2A. He read the name. He read it again. Something in his expression shifted, subtle but unmistakable. The particular alertness of a journalist who has just realized that the story in front of him is significantly larger than the one he came to cover. He opened the notes application on his phone. He typed the date. He typed the time. He typed a single line of description and then kept going because the scene in the aisle was still unfolding, and Nathan Brooks did not stop when things were unfolding. At the jetway door, the gate agent reappeared. "Ladies and gentlemen, we will begin our door close in approximately 10 minutes. Whitmore heard it. His chin lifted. 10 minutes was a deadline, and deadlines were tools, and Gregory Whitmore was very good with tools. He turned back to Rachel with a new quality in his expression. "Then we have 10 minutes to resolve this," he said. "I am not sitting down until this is addressed properly. I'd like to speak with the head of cabin crew." Rachel moved to the galley. She was gone for less than 90 seconds. When she came back, her voice was quieter, and her eyes carried the particular exhaustion of someone who has been doing their job correctly and is being punished for it. "Sir," she said, "I have confirmed her credentials directly. The seat is valid. There is no error in the manifest." Whitmore looked at her for a moment. His voice, when it came, was flat and final. "Then get in seat 2. Simone shifted slightly in her seat, the small adjustment of a person who has been sitting still for a while. As she moved, the lapel of her navy blazer fell open for just a moment, and something slipped forward from inside the jacket. A lanyard, a badge, on a deep blue background with lettering in gold, before she caught it with one hand and tucked it back without looking down. The motion was automatic, habitual. The gesture of someone who had been concealing that badge for a reason and had gotten very good at it. Nathan Brooks, 4 rows back, leaned forward almost imperceptibly. He had seen it. Just a flash. Blue background, gold lettering, the shape and format of a high-clearance credential rather than a standard conference badge. He couldn't read it from where he was sitting. He squinted once, and then sat back, turning it over in his mind, adding it to what he already knew about the name on the manifest. In seat 2A. He kept typing. The pretense collapsed somewhere around the 8-minute mark. It had been maintained barely in the way that people in expensive cabins maintain pretenses through the deliberate study of phones and windows, and the middle distance through the careful arrangement of faces into expressions of mild distraction. But there is a point in every public confrontation where the energy in the room becomes too large to pretend around, and that point had arrived. People were watching now. Not all of them openly, but watching. The way people watch things they know they should stop and cannot. 2 investors near the rear of the cabin, both men in their 50s, both in dark suits that probably cost more than most people's car payments, exchanged a look. One leaned slightly toward the other and said something behind his hand, very quietly, the kind of thing that is said when a person wants to have an opinion, without being attributed one. The other man gave a small nod that communicated everything and nothing at the same time. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke up. Nobody set down their drink and said, "That's enough." There's a name for what was happening in that cabin in those minutes, and it is not neutrality. Neutrality requires an absence of awareness, and everyone in that cabin was fully aware. What they were practicing was something quieter, and more comfortable. The management of personal exposure. The calculation of what intervening might cost versus what staying silent would save. It is a very human calculation. It is also the calculation that makes certain things possible again, across decades and rooms that should know better. Near the middle of the cabin, a younger woman sat with her phone in both hands. She was in her mid-30s, sharp-eyed, dressed professionally, but not expensively, clearly traveling in the orbit of the senior partner seated beside her, rather than in her own right. She had been watching the aisle since the second minute of the confrontation. Her right thumb rested directly over the record button on her phone's camera. She could feel the weight of the decision in that thumb. The specific gravity of pressing, or not pressing, of becoming part of the story, or remaining a witness to it. She did not press it. Not yet. She kept her in seat 2A behind the surface of complete stillness. That Simone Langford had spent a lifetime constructing something else was happening entirely. She was not calm the way an empty room is calm. She was calm the way a bridge is calm because of what it was built to carry, because of how many times it had carried it before. The stillness was not the absence of feeling. It was the management of feeling so precise and so practiced that it had become from the outside indistinguishable from ease. It was not ease. She knew what this cost. She had always known. There had been a boardroom in 2009 in a glass tower in Houston when Aeronova was still young enough that a bad quarter could have ended it. She had walked into that room with 3 patents, 2 government contracts, and a presentation that had taken her team 4 months to build. There had been a man at the head of that table, older than Whitmore, quieter, in the way that certain kinds of arrogance are quiet, who had looked at her when she walked in, and then looked at the man beside her and said, "Is she the assistant?" Not to her, about her. In a room where she was the one who she had answered the question by delivering the presentation. Every number, every projection, every technical specification from memory without notes for 45 minutes. By the end of it, the man at the head of the table had not apologized. Men like that rarely did. But he had signed, and the company had survived the quarter, and the one after that, and the one after that. She had proved it that day because she had needed to. Because the stakes had required her to be the one who spoke. Today was different. Today she would let someone else do the proving. She had earned that much, but earning something and not paying for it anyway are 2 different things, and Simone knew the payment was happening right now in the steady, controlled rhythm of her breathing, in the way she had to consciously keep her shoulders from tightening, in the small, precise work of continuing to exist calmly, inside a moment that was designed, whether consciously or not, to make her. She was carrying 2009. She was carrying the conference in Atlanta, where her name badge had been misspelled as Simon, and 3 people had assumed the error was intentional. She was carrying every room she had ever walked into where someone had done the math on her appearance and arrived at the wrong answer. She was carrying Mobile, Alabama, and the particular weight of having grown up knowing that excellence was not a shield, only a credential, and that credentials could always be questioned by the right person in the right mood. She carried all of it in complete silence, and from the outside, she was simply a woman reading a book. At the 6-minute mark, Whitmore changed tactics. He put away whatever performance of patience he had been maintaining, and let his voice take on the flat declarative quality of a man who has decided that requests have not worked, and statements will. He turned toward Rachel and said, "I will be speaking directly to your airline's executive team after this flight lands. I want the full name of the staff member who confirmed that seat assignment. I will be following up personally." Then he took out his phone. He held it in a way that suggested he was composing a message or initiating a call, though from where most people were sitting, it was impossible to tell which. It didn't matter. The gesture was not really about the phone. It was about the phone being visible. It was about the room understanding that Gregory Whitmore had people to call, that the architecture of consequence extended well beyond this cabin and this moment. That there would be an afterward to this situation, and he intended to control it. Rachel had been doing her job with extraordinary grace for the past 12 minutes. But grace has a threshold, and she had reached hers. She turned from the galley and moved toward seat 2A with the careful deliberateness of someone who needs to do something kind before they lose the ability to do anything at all. She stopped at Simone's row. Her voice was low and genuinely sorry in a way that could not have been performed. "Ma'am, I am so sorry for the disruption. Is there anything I can get you?" Simone looked up from her book. She looked at Rachel, not past her, not through her, directly at her, with an attention that was itself a form of courtesy, the acknowledgement of one person by another. "Just some water, please," Simone said. "Thank you, Rachel." The name. She had used the name. In the middle of a cabin full of people who had been treating Rachel as a function, rather than a person for the past 12 minutes, Simone had said her name, with the particular warmth of someone who sees the human being in front of them and chooses to say so. It was a small thing. It was not a small thing. Rachel nodded once and moved back toward the galley, and if her eyes were brighter than they had been a moment before, she was the only one close enough to know it. Nathan Brooks had been watching all of this from seat 4C with the disciplined attention of someone who has spent 16 years learning to watch. He had what he needed for the beginning of a story. What he did not yet have was the center of it. He had a name from the manifest, a name he had recognized with the particular jolt of recognition that comes when a piece of information you have encountered in professional contexts suddenly materializes in front of you in person. But he needed to be sure. He needed to see the badge. He stood up. He moved toward the forward galley with the easy, unhurried body language of a man who wants a drink and has no other agenda whatsoever. He passed row 2. He kept his eyes forward and slightly down the practiced peripheral attention of a journal. The badge was there. The lapel of Simone's blazer had shifted slightly in the movement of the cabin, and the lanyard had come forward just enough. Nathan had 2 seconds, maybe 3, as he passed. He read 2 words, just 2 before the angle changed, and the moment closed. He returned to his seat. He sat down. He typed the 2 words into his phone, and Nathan Brooks sat very still for a moment. Then he read the first 3 paragraphs of the top result with the focused intensity of a man recalibrating everything he thought he understood about the situation he was sitting inside. His expression did not change dramatically. He was too experienced for dramatic expressions. But something in his posture shifted, a kind of settling the physical signature of a person who has just understood that the story is much larger than the room it is currently occupying. He picked up his pen. He went back to his notes. He drew a single line under everything he had written so far and started a new section. Up in the aisle, Whitmore had stopped performing for the cabin and had turned for the first time to face seat 2A directly. His voice was loud enough for the whole cabin to hear. Not quite raised, but projected in the deliberate way of a man who wants witnesses to what he is about to say, while retaining the ability to later describe it as a private conversation. "Ma'am," he said. He said it with a particular intonation that takes a neutral word and fills it with everything neutral is supposed to exclude. "I don't know how you came to be on this flight. But I believe there may have been an administrative error somewhere in the booking process. For everyone's comfort, it might be best if you—" He stopped. He left the sentence unfinished in the way that certain people leave sentences unfinished, not because they ran out of words, but because the sentence had already done what it needed to do. The implication was complete. Everyone in the cabin had heard it arrive. Simone closed her book. She did it without haste. She placed it in her lap with both hands, squarely the way you set something down when you intend to pick it. She looked at him, the way she had looked at Rachel directly, fully, with the complete attention of a person who has decided this moment deserves her eyes. She did not speak. She simply looked at him, and the silence that followed was not empty. It was full of everything she had chosen not to say for the past 12 minutes, and it had weight and shape, and it was entirely, completely hers. Whitmore opened his mouth to finish what he had started. Whatever he intended to say next, he did not get to say it. The cabin intercom activated with a soft, clean tone, the kind of sound that in any other moment would have been entirely unremarkable, a standard pre-flight announcement, the sort of thing passengers absorb without registering. But the timing of it, arriving in the precise space between Whitmore's unfinished sentence and whatever was going to follow, gave it the quality of an interruption that was also somehow inevitable. As if the moment had been building toward exactly this. The voice that came through the speakers was male-measured and warm in the specific way of someone who has spent decades learning to make people feel safe inside a metal tube at 35,000 feet. Good afternoon, everyone. This is Captain Ethan Mercer. We will be closing the cabin door shortly and preparing for our departure to Washington. Before we do, I want to take a moment to personally welcome a very special passenger aboard today's flight. Whitmore half-turned toward the nearest speaker panel, the mild, reflexive curiosity of a man who assumes any announcement of significance probably concerns someone he knows. Dr. Simone Langford, founder and executive chairwoman of Aeronova Systems, whose sustainable aviation fuel technology is literally powering this aircraft today. Welcome aboard, Dr. Langford. It is, as always, an honor to fly under your program. A pause. Not a long one, just long enough. My boss always did prefer the window seat. The cabin did not react with noise. That was the thing that would stay with Nathan Brooks long after he had filed his article and watched it spread across every major outlet in the country. He had covered enough public moments to know that most of them resolve in sound, in gasps, in the rustle of turning heads, and the low percussion of murmured reactions. This one resolved in something rarer and more complete. Total silence. The kind that doesn't happen when people have nothing to say. The kind that happens when people suddenly understand the full dimensions of what they have been witnessing. And the understanding arrives so fast and so entirely that it takes the breath with it. Every person in that cabin had just been recalibrated. Gregory Whitmore stood in the aisle with his hand raised, a gesture that had been moving toward Rachel, toward another demand, toward another escalation, and the hand simply stopped. It did not lower slowly. It dropped the way things drop, when the muscles holding them stop receiving instructions, falling to his side, with the particular quality of a movement that has been abandoned rather than completed. The color in his face shifted in a way that expensive suits cannot protect against. Not red. Not pale something in between, something that looked like the external expression of a very fast and very unpleasant internal calculation. He said nothing. For the first time in the 16 minutes since he had boarded the aircraft, Gregory Whitmore had 4 rows back. The younger woman, with her thumb over the record button, made her decision. She pressed it. She did it without looking down, without changing her expression, with the practiced invisibility of someone who has decided that this moment needs to exist beyond this cabin and has the presence of mind to make that happen quietly. The phone screen shifted to the small red circle of active recording. She kept it low-angled toward the aisle, and she did not move. Nathan Brooks leaned back in his seat with the slow, deliberate exhale of a man who has been holding a great deal of professional tension and has just been given permission to release it. He looked at the notes on his phone. He looked at the manifest. He looked at the aisle where Gregory Whitmore was standing in a silence that was getting louder by the second. Nathan had been in this business long enough to know a headline when it was given to him directly. And Captain Ethan Mercer had just handed him one over a PA system at 30,000 feet altitude with the whole cabin as witness. He did not smile. He was too professional for that. But something in his expression settled into the particular quiet satisfaction of a person who knows that the work is already done and now simply needs to be written. At seat 2, a Simone Langford reached into the front of her blazer. She did it without theater, without announcement, without so much as a change in the angle of her shoulders. She unclipped the badge from the lanyard, and she fastened it to her lapel with the small, practiced motion of someone who has attached credentials to clothing so many times that the action has become muscle memory. The badge sat against the navy fabric of her blazer in the soft light of the cabin. Deep blue background, gold lettering, Aero Nova Systems across the top and below it. And the same gold executive chairwoman? Then she opened her book. She found her page. She settled the spine against her palm. She resumed reading. She had not raised her voice. She had not made a speech. She had not turned to face the cabin or acknowledged the intercom or looked at Gregory Whitmore in triumph or in anger or in any register that would have given the moment a different shape. She had simply continued to exist in her seat on her flight, powered by her technology, exactly as she had been existing for the past 16 minutes. The only thing that had changed was the badge on her lapel, and the badge had not changed her. It had only made visible what had always been true. The cabin was still quiet. People were not looking at Whitmore now, with the careful avoidance of before. They were looking at him the way people look at something that has become in the space of 30 seconds very difficult to look away from. The gray-suited man who had offered the faint smile of complicity earlier was now studying the back of the seat in front of him with extraordinary concentration. The two investors near the rear, they were both looking at their hands. Rachel stood near the galley with a glass of water that she had poured 2 minutes ago and had not yet delivered because the aisle had been occupied, and now she moved forward and placed it gently on the tray table beside Simone's seat, without a word. Simone reached out and took it without looking up, and the small normalcy of the gesture, the simple human transaction of a drink being offered and received, was the most devastating thing that had happened in the cabin all afternoon. What no one in that cabin knew, what the intercom could not have said, and Nathan's notes did not yet contain, was this: Titan Capital Aviation, the firm that Gregory Whitmore had represented with such precision for the past 16 minutes, the $4.3 billion, the board relationships, the 9 consecutive summits, was currently operating under a licensing agreement with Aero Nova Systems valued at $780 million. The agreement covered the proprietary SAF-7 fuel blend technology that was at this precise moment being consumed by the aircraft's engines at a rate of approximately 400 gallons per hour. Without that license, Titan Capital's 2 regional carrier investments face compliance failures under the new federal sustainable aviation standards that were scheduled to take effect in 14 months. The contract renewal was on the agenda for the National Future of Aviation Summit. It had been on the agenda for 6 weeks. Whitmore knew it was on the agenda. His entire legal team had been preparing for it. What Gregory Whitmore did not know, standing in the aisle of a plane that ran on Simone Langford's chemistry, was that the woman he had spent the last 16 minutes trying to remove from her seat was the sole signatory on the renewal decision. Not a committee. Not a board vote. Her name, her pen, her call. He had been performing power in front of the only person in the room who actually had it. And she was reading a book. The flight landed at Dulles at 4:52 in the afternoon. Nobody spoke about what had happened in the cabin. Not in the jetway. Not in the terminal. Not in the line of black cars waiting outside the arrivals exit. People collected their luggage and made their calls, and looked at their phones, and the silence they maintained was a different kind of silence from the one on the plane. That one had been involuntary, the silence of shock. This one was the silence of people deciding how to carry something they had witnessed and were not yet sure what to do with. Simone took a car to her hotel. She ordered room service. She called her daughter. She slept 7 hours. The video had been uploaded before the plane touched down. The junior associate, whose name was Maya Chen, and who had been attending the aviation summit for the first time in her career, had posted a 43-second clip to her professional social media account with a single line of caption. This happened today on a charter flight to the National Future of Aviation Summit. The woman he tried to remove runs the company that built the fuel system powering the plane. She had not tagged anyone. She had not added commentary. She had let the footage speak for itself, which it did comprehensively and without mercy. By midnight, it had 400,000 views. By morning, it had crossed 2 million. By the time Simone walked into the lobby of the Summit Conference Center 36 hours after landing the counter on Maya's post, read 4.2 million, and it was still climbing. The lobby of the Meridian Center in Washington was the kind of space designed to communicate the seriousness of the people who moved through it. High ceilings, clean lines, the particular hush of a building where important decisions were scheduled in advance and catered. Simone had been in dozens of rooms like it. She had presented in them, negotiated in them, signed documents in them that had redirected the course of an industry she had helped build from a converted warehouse in Huntsville. Alabama with 11 employees and a single government research grant. She walked in and people stepped aside, not the way people step aside for someone visibly powerful making room for the briefcase and the entourage and the performance of arrival. They stepped aside the way people step aside when they recognize someone, when a face they have seen on a screen resolves into a physical presence and the brain takes a moment to close the distance between the two. Several people nodded. A few spoke her name. A woman near the registration desk, young, probably someone's assistant, began to say something and then stopped and simply watched with an expression that had no professional category. Simone accepted a conference lanyard, thanked the woman at the desk by name, and moved toward the elevators. She had a meeting at 9. The room on the 14th floor was a standard conference setup. A long rectangular table, 8 chairs on each side, floor-to-ceiling windows with a view of the city that nobody in the room was looking at. Aeronova's legal team had arrived first and arranged themselves on one side of the table, with the quiet, organized efficiency of people who have prepared for every version of the conversation they are about to have. The 12-page report was printed collated and placed in identical folders at each seat. The folders were closed. 2 federal officials from the Department of Transportation sat near the end of the table. They had not announced their attendance in advance. They had simply appeared as government officials sometimes do when a situation has acquired sufficient visibility to make their presence a matter of institutional prudence rather than personal choice. Both of them had been on flight MV 471. One had been in seat 6B. The other had been 3 rows back. Neither of them had intervened during the incident. That fact was present in the room without anyone saying it, the way certain facts are present in rooms without requiring articulation. Simone sat at the head of the table. She had not arranged for this specifically. It was simply where the chair was when she arrived, and she sat in it with the same uncomplicated directness with which she had sat in seat 2A 2 days earlier. She placed her folio on the table. She poured herself a glass of water from the carafe. Titan Capital's delegation arrived at 9:03. There were 4 of them, 2 senior attorneys, a communications director, whose job it was to manage situations exactly like this one, and Gregory Whitmore. He was dressed as he had been on the plane, a custom suit, a luxury watch, the full architecture of a man who has spent decades using appearance as argument. He walked into the room and absorbed it in one sweep: the Aero Nova team, the federal officials, the closed folders. The woman at the head of the table, and whatever he had prepared himself to find in this room. He had expected damage control, a negotiation, perhaps a settlement conversation conducted with the careful mutual discomfort of 2 parties who both have something to lose and have agreed implicitly to pretend otherwise. He had prepared for that meeting. His attorneys had prepared for that meeting. The communications director had 3 different statements drafted on her laptop, depending on how the room went. The room was not going to go any of those ways, and Whitmore understood this approximately 4 seconds after he sat down in the way that experienced people in high-stakes situations understand things not from evidence, but from the quality of the air. Simone let the silence sit for a moment after everyone had settled. It was not an aggressive silence. It was simply the silence of a person who has decided the meeting begins. When she decides, it begins. Then she opened her phone. The Aero Nova fuel technology license, currently held by Titan Capital Aviation, covers the SAF-7 blend system across 2 regional carrier operations and 1 federal contract aircraft, she said. The license represents 18% of Titan's projected revenue over the next 36 months based on figures from your most recent investor disclosure. She paused not for effect, but because she was precise, and precision requires space. The licensing agreement contains a standard professional conduct clause. Any behavior by Titan Capital personnel that materially damages Aero Nova's commercial reputation or the professional standing of its leadership constitutes grounds for early termination without penalty to Aero Nova. She placed her hand on the closed folder in front of her. Inside this folder is a 12-page report. It includes the flight attendant's formal incident report filed within 2 hours of landing, a first-hand written account from Nathan Brooks of the Washington Business Review, who was seated 4 rows from the incident and documented it in real time. The video footage, which at last count has been viewed 4.2 million times across multiple platforms. And a legal summary from Aero Nova's counsel outlining the applicability of the conduct clause to the documented events. She looked at Whitmore directly, not with anger, not with satisfaction, with the straightforward attention of a person conducting a meeting. "We have 3 options," she said. First, Titan issues a public statement acknowledging the incident on Flight MV. 471 initiates mandatory diversity and professional conduct training for all executive-level staff, and commits in writing to a third-party review of its hiring and conduct practices with results reported to Aero Nova within 90 days. Second, we invoke the conduct clause effective immediately and terminate the contract. Third, we proceed with the renewal as scheduled. And I allow the current public attention around this incident to inform its own conclusions about Titan Capital's suitability as a partner in a federal sustainable aviation program. She folded her hands on the table. "I would like your answer before lunch." The communications director's pen had stopped moving somewhere around the second option. The 2 attorneys were looking at their copies of the conduct clause with the focused attention of people confirming what they already knew. Whitmore sat very still. Then he shifted in his chair, and the thing that had been building behind his expression since he walked into the room came forward not loudly, but with the particular persistence of a man who has never fully accepted a room that wasn't arranged. "This is being blown entirely out of proportion," he said. "What happened on that plane was a misunderstanding, a routine inquiry about a seating confirmation. The coverage has been sensationalized, and I think, if we step back from the noise for a moment, we can all agree that a sound at the far end of the table. Quiet. Deliberate." One of the federal officials had placed a business card on the table in front of him and slid it a few inches toward the center, the way you place something down when you want it seen without making a production of it. The card was simple: Department of Transportation. The name and title printed below it read, Senior Policy Advisor, Office of Aviation Safety and Standards. The man looked at Whitmore with an expression of complete professional neutrality. "I was on that flight. Greg," he said. "Seat 6. B." The room went very quiet. Whitmore looked at the card. He looked at the official. He looked at the folder in front of him, still closed, containing 12 pages of documentation that had been assembled before he walked through the door. He said nothing. And in that silence, the last architecture of the position he had been building for 25 years began quietly. And with Nathan Brooks filed his article at 11:47 that night from a hotel room 2 blocks from the Meridian Center. He had been writing since the plane landed, building the piece the way he built everything that mattered from the outside, in starting with the verifiable and working toward the center, layering each confirmed detail on top of the last until the structure could hold its own weight without needing anything sensational to prop it up. He had the manifest record pulled and confirmed with the charter operator before he left the airport. He had Rachel Donovan's formal incident report, which had been filed with the airline's operations team within 2 hours of landing, and which documented the events in the precise, professionally neutral language of someone who has been trained to describe what happened without editorializing, which made it in its own way more damning than editorializing would have been. He had his own notes time-stamped, continuous, begun at the moment Whitmore had first raised his finger toward Rachel in the aisle. He had the video publicly available. 4.2 million views and climbing. And he had the intercom statement, 14 seconds of audio that the video had captured clearly enough to transcribe verbatim. The headline he chose was not the most dramatic one available to him. It was the most accurate one. Aero Nova Chair, Simone Langford faced removal request from Titan Capital EVP mid-flight. Then the pilot spoke. He read it once more before he submitted. Then he pressed send and poured himself a glass of water and sat in the chair by the window for a few minutes, looking at the Washington lights, thinking about a woman reading a book in seat 2A, with the same composed attention she had shown in a boardroom 14 floors above this city a few hours earlier. The article, by 6 in the morning, it had been read more than 200,000 times. By 9, it was the most shared piece on the Washington Business Review's platform in 14 months. The major outlets began picking it up before the summit's morning sessions had started first. The business press, then the national news organizations, then the broader media ecosystem that processes these moments and decides collectively and very quickly. Whether they are going to become part of the cultural conversation or not. This one was going to become part of it. Nathan had known that since the plane. The article simply gave the conversation the documentation. The coverage that followed was not uniformly kind to Gregory Whitmore, which was not because the reporters covering it were unkind, but because the facts arranged in their correct sequence did not produce kindness as their natural conclusion. Every piece cited the same elements: the manifest confirming the seat, the incident report, the video, the intercom, the badge, the fuel technology, the contract. Each element on its own was a data point. Together, and the portrait was not flattering. Titan Capital Aviation's board convened an emergency session on the morning of the second day. These sessions have a particular quality when they are called in response to external events rather than internal planning. A tightness in the scheduling and absence of the usual preparatory documentation. The sense of a room full of people who would each individually prefer to be somewhere else. The agenda was not published. The attendees were not announced. But the outcome became known within 48 hours, in the way that outcomes from rooms like that always become known. Through the specific channels by which institutional decisions travel, before they become official statements. Gregory Whitmore was placed on administrative leave pending the completion of an internal review into his conduct and its alignment with Titan Capital's stated professional standards. The language of the announcement was careful and complete and said everything it needed to say, while appearing to say as little as possible, which is a skill that corporate communications teams develop over many years and many situations, and which fools nobody. Titan Capital's stock price moved the way stock prices move when something has happened that institutional investors do not like, but have not yet decided how to respond to. It dropped 3.1% over the 48 hours following the initial coverage. Not a collapse, not a crisis in the technical financial sense of that word, but visible, reported, the kind of number that appears in the second paragraph of a business brief and stays there. A small permanent mark on the record of a company's week. 3 institutional investors reached out to Titan Capital's investor relations team to request calls with the board. The requests were phrased as these requests always are in language that was cordial and procedural and left absolutely no room for misunderstanding what was being communicated. The message was not complicated. The message was that certain kinds of stories, once they have achieved a particular velocity in the public conversation, become relevant to investment decisions in ways that extend well beyond the specific incident that generated them. The board understood. The board had always been capable of understanding things when the financial architecture of the situation made them sufficiently clear. The amended AeroNova licensing contract was signed 11 days after the summit. It contained everything Simone had placed on the table in the 14th floor meeting room. The public acknowledgement, the mandatory professional conduct and diversity training for all executive-level Titan Capital staff, the written commitment to a third-party review of hiring and conduct practices with findings to be reported to AeroNova within 90 days. These were not suggestions. They were not aspirational language placed in a preamble and forgotten before the ink dried. They were conditions written into the body of the contract, with the same legal weight as the revenue figures, and the license terms enforceable, documented, and tied directly to the continuation of an agreement that represented 18% of Titan's projected revenue for the next 3 years. The charter airline that had operated Flight MV-471 did not wait to be required to act. Within 3 weeks of the incident, the airline's training division had developed and implemented a new module for all senior cabin crew specifically addressing bias-driven passenger complaints directed at other passengers, covering the legal obligations of cabin staff, the documentation requirements, and the specific protocols for situations in which a passenger attempts to use status or financial leverage to displace another passenger from a confirmed seat. The module was named in the internal training system simply October Protocol. Everyone who worked in the airline's premium cabin operations knew what the name referred to. Rachel Donovan received a formal letter of commendation from the airline's Vice President of Customer Operations, citing her professionalism, her accuracy, and her composure under conditions that the letter described as unusually difficult. The letter was placed in her personnel file. She was offered and accepted a promotion to senior trainer responsible for onboarding and mentoring new premium cabin staff. She took the role without making any public statement about the incident, which was consistent with the person she was. She had done her job correctly. She did not need a camera to have known that. The National Future of Aviation Summit's organizing committee held its annual post-event business meeting 6 weeks after the conference closed. There were 17 items on the agenda. The last item, added by 3 committee members jointly and seconded without discussion by the remainder, was a proposal to establish a new annual fellowship in sustainable aviation engineering funded jointly by the Summit's endowment and a consortium of participating institutions. The fellowship would provide full funding for 2 early career engineers annually, with preference given to candidates from underrepresented backgrounds in the aerospace industry. The vote on the name was unanimous. The Simone Langford Fellowship in Sustainable Aviation Engineering. She was informed by phone on a Tuesday afternoon while she was in a meeting at Aeronova's offices in Huntsville. The call came from the committee chair. Simone listened. She thanked him. She said she was honored, and that she hoped the fellows it produced would go further than she had. Then she went back to her meeting. It was Captain Ethan Mercer, who of all the people caught in the orbit of those 16 minutes on a Colorado tarmac, said the thing that traveled the farthest. He gave a brief interview at the summit 2 days after his flight had landed to a journalist covering the aviation technology panels. The journalist, almost as an afterthought at the end of a conversation about sustainable fuel systems and federal certification standards, asked him why he had made the personal announcement over the intercom. Why not simply let the situation resolve on the ground? Why say anything at all? Mercer was quiet for a moment. He was not a man who rushed toward words. Because she had earned that seat 10 times over, he said, and because silence in that moment would have been its own kind of statement. The interview clip was 40 seconds long. It was shared 1.8 million times. It became in the way that certain plainly spoken true things sometimes do one of the most quoted lines to come out of the entire summit. Repeated in think pieces and social media threads, and at least 2 commencement addresses delivered the following spring. Not at an aviation conference. Not at an industry panel. 40 seconds. A man who had learned to fly in the United States Air Force, who had spent 2 decades in cockpits over 3 continents, who had once been recruited into a career-defining program by a quiet woman from Mobile, Alabama, who had recognized something in him before he had fully recognized it in himself. He had not forgotten what she had done for him. He had simply been waiting for the right moment to say so. The summit ended on a Thursday. By Thursday evening, the conference rooms had been cleared. The name badges collected, the catered lunches reduced to their final round of coffee, and wrapped mints. The conversations that would become contracts, and the contracts that would reshape an industry, had been initiated, and the people who had initiated them were making their way back to airports, and cars, and the ordinary machinery of their lives. Simone checked back into her hotel at 7:30. She did not go to the closing reception. She had attended the panel she needed to attend the meetings she had scheduled. And one meeting she had not scheduled, but had run with the same precision she brought to everything else. She had shaken hands and answered questions, and accepted the particular quality of attention that had followed her through the Meridian Center's corridors for 3 days. The recognition, the occasional look from someone who had seen the video and was now recalibrating the distance between a screen and a room. She had been gracious through all of it, because she was gracious, because that was not performance, but character, and because she understood that the way you carry a moment after it has passed says more about you. She set her bag down. She took off her blazer. She stood at the window for a while. Washington at night has a particular quality of light wide and low and spread across the city in a way that makes the whole thing look from a hotel window like something simultaneously permanent and fragile. Simone had been in this city dozens of times. She had sat in government offices and testified before federal committees and shaken hands in hallways where policy was made and unmade on the same afternoon. She knew the city the way you know a place you have had to earn entrance to. Every time in rooms that were not built with you in mind. Her phone rang. She looked at the screen and answered on the second ring. Her daughter's voice came through warm and immediate, the particular frequency of someone who has been waiting to ask a question and has been patient about it for exactly as long as patience was possible. "Mom, are you okay? I saw everything." Simone sat down on the edge of the bed. She looked at the lights outside the window, and she let herself be tired fully and without apology, in the way you can only be tired when the person on the other end of the phone is someone who loves you without condition. "I'm fine, baby," she said. "I'm tired, but I'm fine." Her daughter asked the questions that daughters ask, and Simone answered them honestly and without drama. And at some point, the conversation moved the way conversations between mothers and daughters do, from the specific to the larger, from what happened to what it means, from the incident on a plane to the longer arc that had produced the woman sitting at a Washington hotel window on a Thursday night in October. Her daughter was a sophomore at Georgia Tech, studying aerospace engineering. She had chosen it herself at 17, without any pressure in either direction, drawn to the field, the way people are drawn to things that live in their blood before they have the language to name them. She would be good at it. Simone knew this the way she knew the SAF 7-blend ratios with the certainty of someone who has studied the underlying structure and understands what it is capable of producing. After the call ended, Simone sat with the phone in her lap for a moment. She did not feel victorious. That was the true thing about it. The thing that the coverage and the fellowship and the amended contract and the 1.8 million shares of Ethan Mercer's 40 Seconds could not fully reach. She had not won something. She had refused once more to lose something. And the difference between those two things is the entire distance between how the world tells these stories and how the people inside them actually experience them. She had been refusing to lose since she was a girl in Mobile, Alabama, standing in the backyard of her grandmother's house, watching jet contrails dissolve into the sky above the Gulf Coast, thinking about the engineering required to produce that line of white against blue. The fuel, the thrust, the materials. Science, the 10,000 decisions that went into putting a human being above the clouds. She had not known at 9 years old. That she would spend her life answering the questions that contrails raised in her. She had simply known that the questions mattered, and that she was going to follow them wherever they led. They had led to the first patent filed when she was 31, in a cramped office in Huntsville, with a legal team that charged her less than they should have because they believed in what she was building. They had led to the second patent and the third, and then to the company itself, Aeronova Systems Incorporated, on a Tuesday in March, with 11 employees and a single federal research grant, and the absolute, unreasonable certainty that sustainable aviation fuel was not a future technology, but a present one waiting for someone willing to do the work. They had led to the billion-dollar valuation, and the board, and the government contracts, and the 14 carriers and the federal programs, and eventually to a seat on a chartered aircraft running on chemistry she had spent 20 years refining. They had also led to every room that had made her prove she belonged in it, every manifest that someone had questioned, every version of the same 16 minutes in different cities in different decades, wearing different faces, but carrying the same essential message. She had absorbed all of it. She had kept building anyway. That was the story. not the triumph at the end. The building. The continuous, costly, unspectacular act of building in the face of a world that kept asking her to justify her presence in the structure she was constructing. Somewhere in a federal aviation database, a record filed on October 14th noted the operational details of Flight M. V's 471 charter Aspen-Pitkin County Airport to Washington Dulles International. Departure time, arrival time, passenger count, crew manifest, mechanical status, and fuel source. The fuel source field contained 4 words: Aero Nova, SAF, 7-blend, certified. In the column beside it, the emissions calculation for the flight. Computed against the standard carbon baseline for a cross-country charter of equivalent distance and payload. 0 net carbon emissions. Verified. The plane that had tried to remove her had flown entirely on her technology. Every mile of it. Every foot of altitude. Every minute of the 4-hour flight that carried Gregory Whitmore and his briefcase and his $4.3 billion from the Colorado mountains to the Capitol had been made possible by the work of the woman he had decided in 3 seconds did not belong in seat 2A. There's nothing more to add to that. The record says what it says. These are the real-life stories that do not make it into history books the first time around. They travel differently. They live in the touching stories passed between women in waiting rooms and break rooms and boardrooms in the texts sent at midnight that say you have to watch this in the conversations between mothers and daughters that begin with "Are you okay?" and end somewhere larger than either of them expected. They live in the black stories, told quietly for years, and then finally, told out loud when the world has run out of reasons not to listen. They live in the life stories of people who were told in 100 small ways, across 100 ordinary moments, that they did not belong, and who showed up anyway, and kept showing up, and built the thing that made the room possible in the first place. If this story moved, you share it. Someone in your life needs to see it today. Drop a comment and tell us, have you ever been underestimated in a room you had fully earned? We read every one, and subscribe, because we are just getting started telling stories like this one. Dr. Simone Langford never raised her voice. She did not need to.